Chapter 16 is interesting for two reasons, really. First, I like that we get introduced to the idea that government actually is involved in what businesses do. When we were talking about the earlier chapters, we really just focused on the business making its own decisions, mostly, where we had the production functions and the cost functions and the different levels of competitiveness and how the companies decided on their prices and their quantities that they wanted to produce. And we also discussed a little bit, especially in the oligopoly section, about how the decisions of other businesses affect how our business is going to make its decisions. And so that was pretty straightforward. But here in chapter 16, there will be this outside entity of the government that will impinge at sometimes, maybe even prop up, I suppose, some of the decisions that a business is going to be able to make. So it introduces the notion that there's this other third party, I suppose, aside from the own business and its competitors, that will have a factor in the decisions that a business is able to make. The other interesting aspect of this chapter is to kind of discuss why the government may want to do this, why the government wants to get involved. When we talked about the pure competition chapter, one of the things that we didn't really mention is that pure competition results in what's going to be called social economic efficiency. It's going to be the most efficient outcome. And we may have a sense of what that means in a sort of what's going to end up being the productively efficient sense. When we talk about efficiency, we just mean that a company is doing something at the least cost or the fastest way that it can. But economists have different ways of defining efficiency, or let's say additional ways of defining efficiency. One way is to say that if businesses are able to produce the goods and services that society desires, and that it does this in a way that there's no waste or as little waste as possible, then we'll call that efficiency. So there's kind of two aspects to that. So by productive efficiency, we mean what we generally think we mean, where businesses are producing the goods and services that they're producing at the lowest total cost to themselves and hopefully total cost to society as well. So they're doing things as fast as they can, where they're lean and mean, if you want to put it that way. In context that we've discussed before, you could say this is when firms are on their expansion paths, where they're always setting prices equal to their minimum of their average total cost. So the important part of that, again, is going to be the fact that they're at this minimum point of their average total cost curve, producing things in the cheapest way that they can. And again, we don't sort of mean cheap in a derogatory sense. We just mean that they're using the least amount of resources to produce the output that they're producing. Allocative efficiency will be a new term for us, but we can think about it from society's perspective, because we have these businesses and they are producing goods and services, and then society demands these goods and services too. We're going to call it an efficient outcome if the businesses are producing the amounts of the goods and services exactly demanded by society, in the sense that society has certain demands and they're willing to pay a price for the goods and services that are being produced. And if there is equality between the amount of goods that are being produced and the amount of goods that are being demanded at that particular price, then we're going to call that allocative efficiency. So another way we can describe this is to say that the highest valuing consumers are going to be able to obtain the item. Everyone who wants to be able to buy an item at the price that's currently being charged is able to get one. And if that is true, then we have allocative efficiency. And we can word this in some other terms that we're familiar with. When the marginal benefit of another unit to the consumers, meaning they have a particular demand for this product and they're willing to pay a particular price for it. The reason they're willing to pay a price is because they obtain some marginal benefit from an additional unit. So whenever that marginal benefit for the consumers equals the marginal cost to society or to the firm of producing that unit, when those two things are equal, then we call this allocative efficiency. So the second part of that, the society or businesses in general incur a certain cost of producing an additional unit, and we call that the marginal cost. They're using the words equal to the marginal cost of society. But again, it's businesses that are producing these things. It's businesses that are actually incurring these costs. So if those two things are equal, if the demand or the marginal benefit from consumers is equal to the supply or the marginal cost of these businesses or of society, then we have this allocative efficiency. Everything that's being demanded at a particular price is able to be fulfilled or able to be supplied at that price. That scenario or that condition holds whenever the price equals the marginal cost. So when is this social economic efficiency achieved? When is the outcome going to be as efficient as an economist would like? Well, it really only happens in pure competition. That's the only situation where you have, in the long run, businesses setting a price equal to the minimum of the average total cost curve, and it's the only situation where price equaled marginal cost. So in the supply and demand equilibrium, we're going to have both of these versions of efficiency occurring, the productive and the allocative efficiency occurring. At that particular market clearing price, the buyers and the sellers both are engaging in these voluntary trades, And we say this maximizes the social surplus, which is a fancy way of saying that you really can't achieve a better outcome for society. So if we have our supply and demand curves here again, and we demonstrate where the equilibrium occurs, and the demand curve, we just labeled it D, but it also reflects the marginal benefit that these consumers have for additional units of these outputs. And if you think of lining all of the demanders up and having your highest demanders at the left-hand end, and as you move to the right, you have lower and lower demanders. The demand curve itself shows you how much additional benefit the consumers have for the next unit that is being produced. And so again, if there's only one unit being produced, if it's in very, very short supply, then the additional benefit of that one unit is very high because it's the only unit that's out there. It's the only unit that's being produced. But again, as you produce more and more of this thing, as more and more of those units get consumed by these consumers, then people start to get satiated and they don't really feel like they need this as much as they used to. So this demand curve slopes down. The marginal benefit curve slopes down. On the supply side, this is the market supply. But if you remember, the market supply curve is derived from the sum of the individual firm marginal cost curves. You can think of the supply curve, again, being the sum of all of the individual marginal cost curves. But again, you can also think of it as societies or business in total, its marginal cost of producing these items. And you have on the demand side the marginal benefit of consumers from obtaining these additional units. And on the supply side, you have the marginal cost of producing these additional units. And the nice thing about equilibrium is that those two things are equal. There is an amount of output, 800 units here, where society says, for the 800th unit, we'd be willing to pay $60 for that. So if you can picture the 800th person in line here who says, I kind of like this product, I'd be willing to pay $60 for it. I don't want to pay 61, and I've got someone after me who wouldn't be willing to pay 60, but I'd be willing to pay $60 for it. I'm the $60 highest valuing person. On the business side of things, on the supply side, you have these different companies producing this output. And at point A, at 800 units, you have a company that produces that 800th unit and says, to entice us to produce that 800th unit, you'd have to pay us $60. That's how much money we require to produce this 800th unit, because that's associated with our marginal cost of producing that unit. So the nice thing about being in equilibrium is that those two things are equal. What about units of output that are less than that are less than the equilibrium quantity? Well, in that situation, if you look at an output of, say, 400 units, let's say businesses decide, well, we're just going to make 400 units today. At that amount of output, that's not very much, considering how much demand there is for it. So we can see on the demand curve that at 400 units of output, the 400th person in line says, well, I'm willing to pay $100 for this thing. I'm still pretty high demander. I'd be willing to pay $100 for the 400th unit of output. Unfortunately, on the supply side, businesses are only willing to supply the 400th unit when they receive $40 for that, or they value that 400th unit at only a price of $40. So businesses are not really enticed to supply that 400th unit that much, even though consumers are willing to pay a lot for it. Consumers are willing to pay $100 for that. But businesses do not really feel like they're receiving too much in exchange for that 400th unit. So you have this gap between how much marginal benefit customers want from this 400th unit and the supply value of that 400th unit. So there's this gap. The marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. And again, that's sort of an indication that output is too low at that point. When you go to the other side of the scale, when you go to an output of 1,000 units, you can see that now we're getting into the range of these customers who don't really value this product all that highly. They're only willing to pay $40 for that. But on the business side, to supply this much output, businesses require people to pay a price of $70. And so for that 1,000th unit, you have consumers not really willing to pay very much for it, but businesses demanding a relatively higher price for that. So now you've got a situation where the marginal benefit of consumers is less than the marginal cost required by these businesses to produce that output. So we're basically producing too much when we're to the right of the equilibrium output. But again, the nice thing about being in pure competition, the nice thing about being in equilibrium is that you have equality between those two things, and both customers and society or businesses are satisfied. So when markets are purely competitive, perfectly competitive, then there really is no problem because there's no way that that outcome can be improved upon. You have the situation where the amount of output being produced and the value that consumers have for the amount of output being produced is exactly equal to the price that businesses are requiring to be paid. So again, you have this 800th person saying, I'd be willing to pay, I believe it was $60 for this 800th unit. And the businesses say, well, we require at least $60 to be paid for this 800th unit. That consumer and that business meet each other and they say, oh, looks like our values are exactly the same. And they're happy. There's no more output produced than that. And there's no consumers having to go home empty-handed. You have no businesses with unsold output and you have no consumers going home empty-handed. So you have this perfect outcome in competitive markets. But certainly some markets are not competitive. We talked about 3 types of them: monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. So there's plenty of markets that are not competitive. And even in situations where it might be competitive, situations can arise where the maximum social surplus does not occur. So there can be improvements even in perfectly competitive markets if you have some of these what are called market failures. And we always have these discussions in economics textbooks about market failures. And there seems to be a whole sort of subset of the economics discipline that focuses on these market failures and the need for the government to come in and solve these things. But I think it somewhat overlooks, and the book goes into this a little bit, somewhat overlooks the existence of government failures too. Again, the presumption is that if the government can come in with proper regulation and proper enforcement of laws and rules, that the outcome is going to be an improvement on what the economy by itself would achieve. But this sort of overlooks the fact that the people enforcing these laws and regulations don't really have perfect incentives either. If we are under the assumption that businesses are only profit maximizing, they don't care about anyone else, they don't care about consumers, they don't care about other businesses, so they have these skewed incentives. Well, people in legislation don't have any incentives to care about what the businesses are having to endure or having to put up with. The fact that businesses have to worry about deadlines and meeting profit targets and making sure that their workers are satisfied and those sorts of things. Bureaucrats don't really care about that. They don't care about how long it takes for a business to comply with their regulations. They don't care about how much red tape there is for a business to go through to be sure they're in compliance. They don't care about how many lawyers a company may need to hire, again, just to make sure that they're in compliance with some of these rules. Obviously, hiring lawyers for your business doesn't really help your bottom line too much. So the incentives are not perfect with government either, even though we may be able to recognize it in pure competition or in other settings in just unregulated markets. These market failures may occur too. So there's going to be 6 types of market failure that we'll discuss. The first issue was this idea of monopoly or market power. And it was, again, the ability of a company to set a price above its marginal cost. The ability of a firm to create demand for its product that is not horizontal, indicating that there's perfect substitutes, but to have demand that is somewhat downward sloping so that it is able to capture some of its customers somewhat, in the sense that they are willing to pay a higher price for its product, even though there may be some decent substitutes out there as well. So the ability of a company to set its price above its marginal cost indicates some degree of market power, and sometimes that people presume that's a bad thing. I'm kind of under the assumption that, well, sometimes how does a firm achieve its monopoly power? Is it by selling a product that people like? Is it by being more efficient? Is it by being the cheapest? Is it by having a good reputation or good quality? I don't necessarily think those things are bad, but people call it market power, and I guess that's supposed to have a negative connotation to it. So if these companies have this market power and they set a price above their marginal cost because they're willing to, or they are able to capture some of their customers, then they're not producing an amount of output that is high enough to satisfy this allocative efficiency constraint. And so when that happens, the output is too little, and that means that the marginal benefit of that unit of output is greater than the marginal cost of that unit of output. So there's not as much social surplus as could otherwise happen. We're going to call this lost social surplus deadweight loss, and we'll have a graph of that in a second, what that means. Deadweight loss is basically the notion that there is this potential for consumers or even businesses, I suppose, to benefit from a situation, but the situation as it is doesn't allow that to happen. If you have firms with market power and they're producing too little, then that means that there's not enough of society's resources that are being devoted to production of this output. Companies are producing too little, so that means that society wants more than there currently is being produced. There's kind of an excess demand for that. And that means that there's not enough of the product being produced. The company is not producing as much as it should. And if society would have its way, it would say, well, we want more land, more labor, more capital devoted to producing this product, because obviously society wants it, since the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So firms with market power are an indication that these resources are being underallocated to this industry. Well, we have our appropriately named Louisiana white shrimp market. From society's perspective, they might have this marginal cost. Society's long-run marginal cost would be this horizontal line here. And you have the demand for these Louisiana white shrimp, downward sloping. And so the competitive outcome would be here at point C, 20,000 units being produced. If that happened, if there was 20,000 units produced and we're at this point C, then you can kind of figure out what happens. The individual companies have a marginal cost and a long-run average total cost associated with this horizontal line. So the price they're charging is equal to their average total cost. So the firms break even. They don't make any economic profit. They just break even. And the consumers earn a bunch of consumer surplus. I believe we talked about that at some point. Consumer surplus is the notion that people on the high end of the demand, if they're willing to pay $300 or $200 or $150, but they don't have to because the price is $100, well, that makes all those people happy. So you can kind of graphically represent the amount of consumer happiness as this triangle here that I'm trying to indicate. So in the competitive outcome, you have the situation where there's all this consumer surplus and the businesses break even. But let's see what happens when we think about a company that has market power. So they have this marginal revenue line that intersects down here. And the demand line is where it was, but you have this marginal revenue line down here. The individual company with market power is going to say, where does our marginal revenue intersect the marginal cost? And that happens at point E. They're only going to produce an output of 10,000 units, and they're going to set a price way up here at $200, whereas before the price was only $100. Here's their average cost. Average total cost was this horizontal line still. Now the price they're charging is way up here at $200. So this becomes the company's monopoly profit. Businesses benefit by charging this price above their average total cost. There's still going to be some consumer surplus because there are still some people willing to pay $300 or $250 or $225 or $201 that only have to pay $200 for this thing. So they are still happy. So there's still some consumer surplus here. It's just not as big. If you remember what the consumer surplus looked like before, it was this very big triangle. And now what happens with this monopoly situation is we still have some consumer surplus left over, but there's a big chunk of that consumer surplus that was lost in this area B, C, M, and F. That's kind of the lost consumer surplus from having this company with its market power. Now, some of that consumer surplus gets translated into monopoly profit. So some of you could call it the consumer's loss is the company's gain. So in that sense, you might say, well, that's bad because consumers are losing. But it's being translated into the business benefiting. So 6 of one, half dozen of another. Consumer loss equals company gain. You also have to notice that there's this other gray triangle here, which is part of the old consumer surplus that the company does not receive as benefit. So this is what we would refer to as that deadweight loss, because this is what used to be benefit to the consumers under the competitive situation that neither the consumers nor this monopoly is able to obtain. So it's just sort of lost happiness. And it's lost partly because of this monopoly power, partly because of the restriction of output from 20,000 down to 10,000 units. You might say, well, why would the company do this? Why would they let this loss occur? I suppose if they could price discriminate, then they wouldn't. But if they're not able to do that, then again, they're just going to do what is profit maximizing for themselves, which is to restrict their output down to 10,000. So again, the result of this is to have this dead weight loss. And the existence of this is one of the reasons why government wants to get involved. It says there is this loss that could be remedied, that could be captured if we were to mitigate some of the monopoly power that this company had. If we could restore this business or this industry back to competitiveness, then we might be able to restore that consumer surplus back to consumers so that it's not just completely lost. Well, if we can say that the purely competitive outcome is the best, and anytime there's a monopoly, it's worse than that, it's something that needs fixing, then you might think, well, okay, the government needs to step in and make this market purely competitive, perfectly competitive, so that that deadweight loss is eliminated. Well, it gets difficult to do that, and it gets hard to know how much market power is too much. How much deadweight loss has to occur before the government steps in. The government's not going to step in every single time that an industry is not perfectly competitive, because again, just conceptually, you can think of there's not really that many industries that are perfectly competitive. Maybe a few commodities, or we mentioned apples, but most industries are not perfectly competitive. And so it would be just difficult for the government to try to solve every one of those problems. And certainly there's plenty of markets that are not perfectly competitive that consumers are still perfectly happy with. So a small amount of market power people are willing to put up with. And again, there really isn't any clear guidelines as to how much market power is too much. The government does have some limits. We talked about the Herfindahl Index, which is used for mergers. And so if a merger is being considered where after the merger happens, if the Herfindahl Index were to exceed this $2,500 threshold, then the Justice Department says, well, this market is now concentrated. And they don't negate the merger. They don't deny the merger completely, but they subject this to this strict review, and it could be negated or it could be turned down. It will let some other mergers go through, though, so there's other factors that go into play other than just what the Herfindahl Index is. How do companies achieve market power? The book will mention 3 ways. They can either actually monopolize an industry, just try to take over all the businesses that are out there or run them all out of business, or they can even attempt to do that. Even the attempt to maybe do something like limit pricing might cause some of the firms to leave, some of the new entrants to be dissuaded from entering. There may also be cartels that are formed and collusive arrangements that make all of the businesses in an industry act as one unit, act as a monopoly. And of course, you can also have mergers among horizontal competitors, so mergers among firms producing substitute products. There's a 4th way that the book doesn't really mention that I mentioned earlier. It could just be that the business is very successful and the business produces a product that people like, and the business is very efficient and produces a product that is of high quality, of low cost, of low price. So that's certainly a way that businesses can grow very big, and maybe a lot of the successful businesses these days achieve through that route. And whether you just define that as actual or attempted monopolization, or if you define that as satisfying your customers and finding a lot of support for the product you produce, I guess depends on your perspective. The government is a little more lenient than I may have let on before. Deciding whether a business or an industry is being monopolized or whether a company has too much market power depends not just on its size, on the face of it. I mean, there are some industries that are very large. Walmart obviously is a huge company in the world and just a huge company in the retail industry. But what do? They don't necessarily charge monopoly high prices. They actually charge low prices. So the determination of whether a company is a monopoly or not is more than just, is it a big company or does it have large market share? Because the government really also looks at the behavior of the company. What is it doing? How is it trying to achieve this monopolization? Is it trying to grow, or is it undertaking activities that only have the outcome of securing monopoly power for itself? So again, this might be something like the mergers where it's really only trying to do these mergers to increase its market share as large as it can. Is it engaging in these kind of monopolizing behaviors? And is it actually able to do this? Sometimes businesses may try to even engage in what we might call shady behaviors, or behaviors that are only aimed at trying to increase its market share to become really big so that they can set a really high price someday. But if they're not good at it, if they're unsuccessful at becoming really big, then the government kind of takes it easy on those companies too. So aside from that, though, it's kind of funny. You can let businesses go if they're not successful at achieving a high degree of market power. But the government also can be pessimistic about, if you're even trying to become a monopoly, then you can be found guilty. The government can prevent a merger like that from happening, or the antitrust authorities can get involved. So you don't even have to be successful at monopolizing. All you have to do is attempt it, and if there's what they call this dangerous probability of success, then the government may get involved. I kind of love looking at antitrust stuff because you look at how lawyers and politicians try to analyze different economic scenarios, and it's kind of, I don't exactly know what they mean by a dangerous probability of success, if that's 70% or 72.4%. You put this word dangerous in there and it has some connotations to it. So anyway, some of these conditions are a little looser. Some of them may be a little more strict. It really depends a lot on who's in charge of the Justice Department at the particular time, who's leading the antitrust division. It depends on the president, how strongly they want the antitrust department to go after these companies. It depends on the Supreme Court and how lenient they have been in hearing antitrust cases. So a lot of factors go into this. And again, there's not really any clear rules of thumb that we can follow definitely every time. We've talked about the idea of a natural monopoly in the past. This was a situation where a company had this really long range of economies of scale, where their long-run average total cost curve, as the output increased even to a really high level of output, that long-run average total cost curve just kept declining and declining, and it didn't start turning up until some really huge level of output. And that meant that the cheapest way, or the most productively efficient way for a company to operate, was to become really huge. And so it's a monopoly. I mean, to be a really huge industry generally implies that your market share has to be really huge. If you're going to produce a huge amount of output, then that doesn't leave much left over for the rest of the companies that are out there. So what does the government do? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to break the company up, because if you realize that there's this really long range of declining average cost, that you hit the minimum point at this really high level of output. Well, if you're going to break that company up, let's say you break it in half, well, then that means that each of those separate companies now is producing half as much output as they were before. So you have to move halfway to the left on the long run average cost curve. And that means you're going to be at a lot higher average total cost of producing that output. So breaking the company in half means that its average costs are going to go up, and it probably means that their prices are going to go up too. We also know that we're not going to be at the minimum point of that long run average total cost curve anymore. So we're going to not be achieving productive efficiency. And again, you get costs going up, probably is going to mean that prices are going to go up too. I'm not sure how that's supposed to help customers. So when you have this natural monopoly situation, there's not really a good way of determining what the best price would be if the authorities don't like the price that the company is currently setting, that the monopoly is currently setting, the unregulated price. If they feel like that's not the best price, then it's difficult to know what the best regulated price would be, and we'll see why. Here you've got a company with this long portion of declining average costs, and we have our demand marginal revenue curves here, and you can see what the company would do. They would figure out where marginal revenue equals marginal cost here at point W, 20,000 units of output. They would go up and set their price at M, and they would have their costs here, so they'd be making a certain amount of profit. We can see how much dead weight loss we would have in that monopoly situation as this triangle here, MWS. So that, again, that represents loss to consumers that no one is able to gain. So the government might say, well, the problem here is that output is too low, prices are too high. This business is making all this profit too. Why don't we have these companies produce output that's equal to what the competitive amount of output would be? Because that would be, you have this marginal cost line, and where that intersects the demand curve, then you would have allocative efficiency, point S here, 40,000 units. Well, yeah, producing 40,000 units would be allocatively efficient, but what does it look like for the company's cost? This is the price they'd be able to charge, $250. Again, that's for this marginal cost demand curve intersection. The price they would charge for this output would be $2.50 for the 40,000 units. But you can see that that's below the company's costs. That's below the company's total cost. So they'd be having a loss. Well, it's difficult to, without tax incentives or without some sort of propping up, some sort of bailout, this business is not going to be able to survive forever, just having these continuous T minus S losses per unit. So if the problem is we think that this company is not producing enough and they're charging too much for it, and we want them to produce 40,000 units, well, you risk the company folding completely and going bankrupt and producing 0 units instead of producing 40,000 units. So setting this allocatively efficient price doesn't seem to be perfect, because you're just sort of guaranteeing losses a lot of times. You might also say, well, okay, why don't we increase output from the monopoly output, 20,000? Why don't we set it to where the price that the company charges is equal to their long-run average cost? So we'll let them break even. The break-even point would be at point Z here, selling at $4.50, and you get 30,000 units produced. Okay, well, you could maybe do that. It's not perfect either. Well, it might be an improvement on the monopoly case, because you're increasing your output from 20 to 30,000. You're certainly not getting it all the way to the allocative efficiency point, because you haven't produced it to the 40,000. So you're still producing some amount of output that's too low. You're also setting a price that's above the marginal cost. So again, we recognize that as not being best either. There's some other issues that aren't really showing up here. If the company knows that it has to follow this rule where the price it charges is the break-even price, then what sort of incentives does that suggest to the business? Well, we have our management, and we're thinking of really cracking down on our workers and making them work harder, or we're thinking about investing in expensive new equipment that's going to make us more efficient. Well, if you do all that, if you try to become more efficient and push your costs down, then okay, you might push your costs down so that this point Z moves down here somewhere. But the regulation says, well, you have to charge a break-even price. You can't earn any profit. So there's really no incentive to be more efficient if the law says that you always have to break even. And so you can think of it the other way too. If there's no good reason to be efficient, then there's no bad reason to not be efficient. There's no bad reason for being lazy. And even if we have the slow stuff, if our costs go up because we have all this slow equipment, If our long-run average cost curve gets pushed up because of all our inefficiencies, well, the law still says we can charge a price that lets us break even. So you could actually raise your price if your long-run average costs go up. So if you always know you're breaking even, then again, it introduces some other problems too. Another issue of quote-unquote market failure is this idea of externalities. An externality is any cost or benefit that an outside party incurs. For any transaction, you have a buyer and you have a seller. And most of the costs and benefits in that trade or engaged in the production or sale of that product are kind of confined to those two people. So if you buy a car, then, well, the company incurs some cost in producing that car, but they receive payment. They receive some, reward, some payment from you, the price of the car. And you have to give up some money for your car, but you get this big benefit of having the car at the end of the day. So most of the costs and benefits are kind of confined to the buyer and the seller. But if we also think about the process of the producing of that car, it's loud and it might pollute a little bit. And so the people who live around that town where the car factory is, they may be harmed by the production of that car too. They may have some costs imposed on them because there's this loud noise, there's this pollution in the air. Do they get compensated for those costs? I mean, the company, again, incurs costs. I mean, the workers there are sweating and it's loud for them too, and they have to buy all these raw materials. So the company is incurring a lot of these costs. But the nice thing about the trade is that the buyer compensates them for that. The buyer says, here's a bunch of money to compensate you for all the raw materials you used and for all the loud noise and all the sweat that your employees had to put up with. So any of the costs the company bears, the buyer kind of compensates them for that. But what about the costs of the people in the town that they bear, the sound and the pollution? They don't get compensated by the buyers. The buyer doesn't say, well, here, give some money to the town too. So there's this external cost that the people in the town have to bear that they don't get compensated for. So we would call that a negative externality because it imposes a cost on some outsider. You could think of positive externalities too, I suppose. I always thought of maybe I've never been there, but in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where they make the Hershey chocolate, I imagine the people who live in that town might have some good smells. So what is the problem with having these externalities? Well, if you think about the amount of cars being produced, okay, you have costs that the company bears, but you also have these costs that the townsfolk bear. And the buyers do some compensation. I mean, they provide some compensation, but it's not enough to cover all of the costs. If the people engaged in this trade, the buyers and the sellers, they ignore those costs that spill over. They ignore those externalities. And so really there's more costs that are occurring than either the buyer or seller are aware of. And from the townspeople's perspective, because these cars are noisy, because there's the pollution, the townspeople would probably say there's too many cars being made right now because it's too loud. There's too much pollution. They would like the amount of car production to be reduced because of these costs that they are bearing. But since neither side really accounts for the cost that they bear, the buyer of the car, the seller of the car don't account for the cost that the townsfolk bear, then their costs just get ignored essentially. And so the car company produces the amount of cars that only the buyers want. They don't really consider the reduction in car production that the townsfolk would want. And these competitive market prices aren't going to capture any of that. Same sort of thing with positive externalities. If you have the people in Hershey, Pennsylvania that like the chocolate smell, they would prefer there be more chocolate being produced to benefit them. But the buyers and sellers of chocolate themselves are not going to take their benefits into account. And so there'd be sort of an underproduction of chocolate from society's perspective. So we can talk about this issue of social cost. We recognize the private cost that the private company is bearing in purchasing the raw materials and paying the workers. But there are these external costs too that the townsfolk have to bear. And so the true cost of producing these products should be the social cost, the private cost plus the external cost combined. So if we think about just the typical private demand curve and the private supply curve, they call this the MPC, the marginal private cost. So this is just the cost that the company bears. And again, the raw materials, paying the workers, that sort of thing. And you'd get this outcome, this competitive outcome with price and an amount of output here being produced. But you have these townsfolk where when the quantity of cars being produced goes up, their costs go up too. They have to bear more and more pollution and noise as there's more and more cars being produced. So there's this marginal external cost too that these townsfolk have to bear. Well, the total marginal cost, or the marginal social cost, should be the vertical summation of those two things. So if we're going to produce QC amount of output, I know what the marginal private cost is right here at point PC, or that value of PC. But I also need to add in this amount of the marginal external cost too. So I kind of bump my curve up about that distance. So I get this vertical summation of those two, and this represents the total marginal cost of the company and the townsfolk combined. So what kind of outcome would happen if there was equality between the marginal benefit and the total marginal social cost? Well, you'd have the equilibrium here at point E, which is, as we would expect, a lower amount of output and a higher price to try to dissuade those consumers from buying these cars, to reduce the amount of car production to benefit the townsfolk, so there's not as much noise, not as much pollution. You could think of the alternative situation with the positive externality, actually where you would have the marginal social cost would be below the marginal private cost curve, and it would suggest that the output would be increased or should be increased. But here, the competitive amount of output is too high, the price is too low compared to if we were to account for all of those marginal social costs combined. So the government may step in and say, if there are these externalities, these negative externalities, then the government may say that we need to restrict the amount of output somehow. We may need to raise the price of these goods somehow. Another issue with market failures is this notion of non-excludability. If a company produces a car, then it sells that car to a buyer, and really the buyer just kind of drives away with it and they're happy. When you have issues of non-excludability, then you might think of a situation like a drive-in movie theater. You have a company that's selling tickets to its drive-in movie. I don't know if any of you know what that is anymore. I don't even know if they have these things. It was a place that it was like a big parking lot, and you would get a little speaker that you could attach to your car, and you would just sit in your car basically and watch a movie on a big screen. So it was outside. You'd watch this movie on a big screen. You get the sound coming in through the little speaker. So you wouldn't really have to get out of your car to watch the movie. And they would just project this thing on this huge screen. Well, I don't know how easy it would be to prevent someone from sitting outside the fence of the drive-in movie theater and just watching the whole movie from the outside, or standing on a ladder over the fence and watching the whole thing. They might not get the sound, but they'd at least see all the pictures. And so it would be difficult to exclude a non-payer from consuming that firm's product. We have what they call this free rider problem. People try to get the benefit of this product without paying any price at all. And some kinds of products are like that. Some products you can't exclude non-payers from consuming it. And this can occur in two different situations, whether you have common property resources or you have public goods. And again, there's sort of both different flavors on this notion of not being able to exclude non-payers from consumption of this good. And you can presume what might happen if you have all of these non-payers who are consuming your item, then, well, the company's not going to produce enough to satisfy the people who want to consume it, especially the ones who aren't paying anything for it. So from society's perspective, there should be more production of this product, but private individual companies don't have an incentive to produce enough, don't have an incentive to produce as much as society wants. A common property resource problem is a resource that is useful in production or useful just for consumption, that it's difficult to know who owns it. It's difficult to assign property rights for it. So you can think of things like the ocean and fishing. It's difficult to know who owns which particular plot of the ocean. And of course, the fish can just kind of move from my plot to your plot. You look at a particular area of the ocean and there's a bunch of fish there, and you're like, oh, this is great. I'm going to buy this plot of ocean. Well, those fish can easily move from one day to the next, and all the fish that you thought were going to be there aren't going to be there anymore. So it's difficult to set property rights in certain situations. And in that case, what happens is that people know, well, if I go and take all those fish now, since no one owns those fish, no one owns that plot of ocean, then, well, if I take all those fish, then I'm not really harmed by that. And there's really no incentive to protect the amount of fish that are there, because if I let those fish go, because I say, well, I'm going to be smart about this, I'm going to be a good steward of the planet, and I'm going to let these fish go and reproduce, there'll be more fish for everybody later on. Well, you go and leave those fish. The next person coming along says, well, he left those fish. He doesn't own them. I don't own them. I'm just going to take them if he doesn't take them. So areas of common property resources, it's because you can't exclude people from consuming what's in it. Then, again, they're generally overexploited, not produced enough. Another issue of this common property non-excludability is the idea of public goods. Public goods have a particular definition that not only are they non-excludable, so it's difficult to exclude people from consuming it, but they are what they call non-depletable, meaning they don't go away. They're also non-rivalrous, which means that if you consume it, it doesn't affect my ability to consume it. So a lot of times people will talk about national defense as this sort of thing. So if you have two people in your country who say, we want national defense, we want an army to protect our borders. You have two people that are willing to that want that and are willing to pay for it. And you have two other people who might want it but are not willing to pay for it. Or they just don't have enough money, or they don't care, they don't want to pay for it at all. Well, to protect the two people that want the national defense, you're essentially going to be also protecting the two people who don't want the national defense. Defending the two people who do want to pay it doesn't negate the defense of the two other people. So my consumption of national defense doesn't affect your consumption of national defense, where we both are protected by it equally, even though I might be paying it and you're not. It's difficult to sometimes find public goods perfectly. There are other goods that might be kind of closer to this definition than others. But anytime there's an aspect of public goodness, if I want to say that, anytime there's an aspect of public goods characteristics to a product, then there may be this dead weight loss. There may be this underproduction of the product. In an extreme case, public goods sometimes are argued that they shouldn't be produced by private companies at all, since they don't have an incentive to produce it, and that all public goods should be publicly provided. This kind of goes into the argument for public provision of roads and schools and things like that, where private individual companies may not have the incentive to produce it. I mean, if one company says, well, we're going to build a road connecting Shreveport and Ruston, and we're just going to allow all the people who pay to drive on that road, it's kind of hard to prevent the non-payers from driving on that road too. And so the government says, well, since no individual company wants to build this road, then I guess we have to, since we know that road is valuable. Other issues of market failure, well, a last one, I guess, is this issue of information. One of the assumptions when we talked about markets and this purely competitive outcome was that people had information about a lot of things. People knew about the quality of the product. They knew about the prices of products. So I knew that Farmer Bob's apples were this price, and I knew that Farmer Joe's apples were that price, and I knew about all these other substitutes that were out there. And so knowing all of that made markets more competitive. But what if you didn't know? I mean, if you're just looking at Farmer Bob's apple stand and you didn't know about Farmer Joe, then Farmer Bob might be able to charge a high price to you and kind of take advantage of the fact that you don't have perfect information about his prices or the prices of available substitutes. What if he charges you the same price as Farmer Joe? What if you had information about prices, but you didn't know that his apples were of lower quality because he doesn't use as good of equipment? He doesn't use as high of quality in the production of his apples as the other farmers do. So he would basically be profiting off of you because his costs aren't as high because he's not using the best methods. But you wouldn't know because you didn't know about the quality beforehand. Imperfect information can lead to problems in market settings too. Consumers may overestimate the quality of a good or a service. They may think that the product is too good and they demand too much of it. They may underestimate the quality of it and demand too little of it. We have this presumption that the amount of demand is consistent with the quality of the item, but that doesn't have to be the case. So we can see what it would look like in a situation of particular products that consumers didn't have complete information about. But again, we'll sort of show the assumption that consumers figure out how much quality they think the product has and the amount of supply of that product. But in this case, we'll say that the consumers overestimate the quality of the product. The product is actually worse than they think it is. And if they knew how bad the product would be, they wouldn't demand it as much. That marginal social benefit would be lower, reflecting the true quality of the item. And of course, if consumers knew that, then the amount that they would want to buy and the price they'd be willing to pay would both be lower. So this QC, the competitive outcome, would be too much output. The price would be too high, and the amount of the output being supplied would be greater than that marginal social benefit. There'd be this dead weight loss. Companies are supplying an amount of output up here that's a lot higher than what consumers would value if they knew about the actual quality.